As students of psychology, you will spend a fair amount of time learning about Sigmund Freud's ideas. In fact, even people who are relatively unfamiliar with psychology have some awareness of psychoanalysis, the school of thought created by one Sigmund Freud. Freud believed that events in our childhood have a great influence on our adult lives, shaping our personality. For example, anxiety originating from traumatic experiences in a person's past is hidden from consciousness and may cause problems during adulthood in the form of neurosis. Thus, when we explain our behaviors to others or ourselves, which is a conscious mental activity, we rarely give away true accounts of our motivation. This is not because we are deliberately lying. While human beings are great deceivers of other people, they are even more adept at self-deception. Freud's life work was dominated by his attempt to find ways of penetrating this often subtle and elaborate camouflage that obscure the hidden structure and processes of personality. His lexicon has become embedded within the vocabulary of Western cultures and even Westernized cultures such as our own. Words he introduced throughout his theories are now used by everyday people, such as anal, which is about personality and not something else, libido, denial, repression, cathartic, Freudian slip, and even neurosis. While you may have some passing knowledge of his key concepts or the key concepts of psychoanalysis like the unconscious, fixation, defense mechanisms, and dream symbolism, you might wonder exactly how these ideas fit in together and what influence they really have on contemporary psychology. In this video, we will take a deep dive at Freud's psychoanalytic theory, and then we will take a critical view of his ideas by discussing his concept of humanity. But before all of that, let us first talk about Freud's life. Sigismund, or Sigmund for ease of saying, Freud was born either on March 6 or May 6, 1856 in Freiburg, Moravia, which is now part of the Czech Republic. Actually, scholars disagree on his birth date. The first date was but 8 months after the marriage of his parents. Now, Freud was the firstborn child of Jacob, who is a Jewish wool merchant who had been married once before he wed the boy's mother, and Amalie Nathan's son, Freud. Although his father had 2 grown sons, Emmanuel and Philip, from his previous marriage. Now, Jacob and Amalie Freud had 7 other children within 10 years. The father, 40 years old at Freud's birth, seemed to have been relatively remote and authoritarian figure, but Sigmund remained the favorite of his young indulgent mother, which may have partially contributed to his lifelong self-confidence. Freud's strongest, if also most ambivalent attachment, seems to have been to a nephew named John, 1 year his senior, who provided the model of intimate friend and hated rival that Freud reproduced often at later stage of his life. When Freud was about 1.5 years old, his mother gave birth to a second son, Julius, an event that was to have a significant impact on Freud's psychic development. Sigmund was filled with hostility towards the younger brother and harbored an unconscious wish for his death. However, when Julius died at 6 months of age, Sigmund was left with feelings of guilt at having caused his brother's death. When Freud reached middle age, he began to understand that his wish did not actually cause his brother's death, and that children often have a death wish for a younger sibling. This discovery purged Freud of the guilt he had carried into adulthood, and by his own analysis, contributed to his later psychic development. In 1859, the Freud family was compelled for economic reasons to move to Leipzig and then a year after to Vienna, where Freud remained until the Nazi annexation of Austria 78 years later. Despite Freud's dislike of the imperial city, in part because of its citizens' frequent anti-Semitism, psychoanalysis reflects in significant ways the cultural and political context out of which it emerged. For example, Freud's sensitivity to the vulnerability of paternal authority within the psyche may well have been stimulated by the decline in power suffered by his father's generation, often liberal rationalists in the Habsburg Empire. So to his interest in the theme of the seduction of daughters was rooted in the complicated ways in the context of Viennese attitudes towards female sexuality. Freud was drawn into medicine not because he loved medical practice, but because he was so intensely curious about human nature. He entered the University of Vienna Medical School with no intention of practicing medicine. Instead, he preferred teaching and doing research in physiology, which he continued even after he graduated from the university's Physiological Institute. Freud might have continued his work indefinitely had it not been for two factors. First, he believed, probably with some justification, that as a Jew, his opportunities for academic achievement or advancement would be limited. Second, his father, who helped finance his medical school expenses, became less able to provide monetary aid. Reluctantly, Freud turned from his laboratory to the practice of medicine. He worked for 3 years in the General Hospital of Vienna, becoming familiar with the practice of various branches of medicine, including psychiatry and nervous diseases. Freud's scientific training remained of cardinal importance in his work, or at least in his own conception of it. In such writings as the Project of Scientific Psychology, he affirmed his intention to find a physiological and material basis for his theories of the psyche. Here, a mechanistic neuropsychological model vied with a more organismic phylogenic one in ways that demonstrate Freud's complicated depth to the science of his days. In 1885, he received a traveling grant from the University of Vienna and decided to study in Paris with the famous French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot. His 19 weeks in the French capital proved a turning point in his career. For Charcot's work with patients classified as hysterics introduced Freud to the possibility that psychological disorders might have their sources in the mind rather than the brain. Charcot's demonstration of a link between hysterical symptoms such as a paralysis of a limb and hypnotic suggestion implied the power of mental states rather than nerves in the etiology of diseases. Although Freud was soon to abandon his faith in hypnosis, he returned to Vienna in February 1886 with the seed of his revolutionary psychological method implanted. Now, several months after his return, Freud married Martha Bernays, the daughter of a prominent Jewish family whose ancestors included a chief rabbi of Hamburg and Heinrich Heine. She was to bear 6 children, one of whom, Anna Freud, was to become a distinguished psychoanalyst in her own right. Although the glowing picture of their marriage painted by Ernest Jones in his study, The Life and Works of Sigmund Freud, has been nuanced by later scholars, it is clear that Martha Bernays Freud was a deeply sustaining presence during her husband's tumultuous career. Shortly after getting married, Freud began his closest friendship with the Berlin physician Wilhelm Fleiss, whose role in the development of psychoanalysis has occasioned widespread debate. Throughout the 15 years of the intimacy, Fleiss provided Freud an invaluable conversational partner for his most daring ideas. Freud's belief in human bisexuality, his ideas of erotogenic zones on the body, and perhaps even his imputations of sexuality to infants may well have been stimulated by their friendships or by their friendship. A somewhat less controversial influence arose from the partnership Freud began with the physician Joseph Breuer after his return from Paris. Freud turned to a clinical practice in neuropsychology, and the office he established was to remain his consulting room for almost half a century. The two men had collaborated on the publication of a series of case studies on the patients called Studies on Hysteria. Before their collaboration began, during the early 1880s, Breuer had treated a patient named Bertha Pappenheim, or Anna O, as she became known in the literature, who was suffering from a variety of hysterical symptoms. Rather than using hypnotic suggestion as had Charcot, Breuer allowed her to lapse into a state of resembling autohypnosis, in which she would talk about the initial manifestations of her symptoms. To Breuer's surprise, the very act of verbalization seemed to provide some relief from their hold over her, although later scholarship has cast doubt on its permanence. The talking cure, or chimney sweeping as Breuer and Anna O respectively called it, seemed to act cathartically to provide a discharge of the pent-up emotional blockage at the root of the pathological behavior. Although Freud was enthusiastic about the new method, his emphasis on the exclusively sexual cause of hysteria made his theories unpopular not only with the superiors at the university but also with Breuer. From 1896 to 1901, in a period of isolation from his colleagues, Freud developed the basics of psychoanalytic theory out of the raw material of his patients, his conversations with Breuer, and his correspondence with Fleiss. And in 1899, Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, the first fully fleshed out psychoanalytic work, was published. Freud was deeply disappointed by its lackluster reception, but he continued writing. The Psychopathology of Everyday Life was published in 1901, and his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality was published in 1905. In the 1900s, Freud finally emerged from the isolation that had characterized his professional life in the 1890s. He began to have weekly meetings at his house to discuss psychoanalytic theory. The group that met at his house was called the Wednesday Psychological Society, and eventually it grew into the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. By 1904, Freud had begun to hear other neurologists and psychiatrists using his techniques. Now, during World War I, Freud continued to write and lecture, but patients were few and international communication were impossible. When the war ended, however, the International Psychoanalytic Association resumed its meeting in an atmosphere much more conducive to psychoanalysis than that before the war. Unfortunately, the post-war years were extremely difficult in Vienna. Inflation was rampant, supplies were few, and patients were rare. Freud's reputation, however, was growing, and in 1919, he was made a full professor at the University of Vienna. Freud's work from 1919 to the end of his life in 1939 became increasingly speculative. He became concerned with applying psychoanalysis to questions of civilization and society, an approach that he had tried in 1913, Totem and Taboo. In 1920, he published the Beyond Pleasure Principle, which suggests that human existence is a struggle between eros, or the sex drive, and instinct towards death, which he called thanatos. Now, in 1923, Freud was diagnosed with mouth cancer, a consequence of his lifelong habit of cigar smoking. His illness would trouble him until his death in 1939, demanding in the meantime 33 separate operations that caused him pain and made it difficult for him to speak and eat. The 1920s were a complicated decade for Freud. He was undeniably successful, even famous, but his own health, several deaths in his family, and the disintegration of the community made this success bittersweet. In 1930s, Freud continued to treat patients and to write. He published one of his most frequent read books, Civilizations and Its Discontent, in 1930. The rise of Nazism in Germany, however, and the echoes of Austria made life in Vienna increasingly untenable. Freud stayed as long as he could, but when the Nazi invaded Austria in 1938 and raided his house, he fled to England with most of his family. He died there on September 23, 1939. Now, Freud, of course, was fortunate that his name did not become indelibly tied to cocaine or mouth cancer. Instead, his name has become associated with psychoanalysis, the most famous of all personality theories. What makes Freud's theory so interesting? First, the twin cornerstone of psychoanalysis, sex and aggression, are two subjects of continuing popularity. Second, the theory was spread beyond its Viennese origin by an ardent and dedicated group of followers, many of whom romanticized Freud as a nearly mythological and lonely hero. Third, Freud's brilliant command of language enabled him to present his theories in a stimulating and exciting manner. Freud's understanding of human personality was based on his experiences with patients, his analysis of his own dreams, and his vast readings in various sciences and humanities. These experiences provided the basic data for the evolution of his theories. To him, theory followed observation, and his concept of personality underwent constant revisions during the last 50 years of his life. Evolutionary though it was, Freud insisted that psychoanalysis could not be subjected to eclecticism, and disciples who deviated from his basic ideas soon found themselves personally and professionally ostracized by Freud. Although Freud regarded himself primarily as a scientist, his definition of science would be somewhat different from that held by most psychologists today. Freud relied more on deductive reasoning than on rigorous research method, and he made observations subjectively and on a relatively small sample of patients, most of whom were from the upper middle class and upper classes. He did not quantify his data, nor did he make observations under controlled conditions. He utilized the case study approach almost exclusively, typically forming a hypothesis after the facts of the cases were known. In this section of the lesson, we will talk about specifics of the psychoanalytic theory. We will begin by talking about the levels of mind, followed by the provinces of the mind, more commonly known as id, ego, and superego, and then we will talk about certain dynamics of personality. We will finish this part by talking about defense mechanism and Freud's stages of human development. Freud's greatest contribution to personality theory is his exploration of the unconscious and his insistence that people are motivated primarily by drives of which they have little or no awareness. To Freud, mental life is divided into two levels, the unconscious and the conscious. The unconscious, in turn, has two different levels, the unconscious proper and the preconscious. In Freud's psychology, the three levels of mental life are used to designate both a process and a location. The existence as a specific location, of course, is merely hypothetical and has no real existence within the body. Yet, Freud spoke of the unconscious as well as unconscious processes. Now, in order to understand Freud's theory, it's essential to first understand what he believed each part of the personality did, how it operated, and how these three elements interact to contribute to the human experience. Each level of awareness has a role to play in shaping human behavior and thought. Freud delineated the mind in this distinct level, each of which with their own roles and function. Now, the preconscious consists of anything that could potentially be brought into conscious mind, like your first address or the name of your teacher back in grade 1. Now, the conscious mind contains all of the thoughts, memories, feelings, and wishes of which we are aware at any given moment. This is the aspect of our mental processes that we can think and talk about rationally. This also includes our memory, which is not always part of consciousness, but can be retrieved easily and brought into awareness. Now, the unconscious is the reservoir of feelings, thoughts, urges, and memories that are outside of our conscious awareness. The unconscious contains contents that are unacceptable or unpleasant, such as feelings of pain, anxiety, conflict, and even sex. Freud likened the three levels of mind to an iceberg like this. The top of the iceberg that you can see above the water represents the conscious mind. The part of the iceberg that is submerged below the water but is still visible is preconscious, and the bulk of the iceberg that lies unseen beneath the waterline represents the unconscious. Now, one way to understand how the conscious and the unconscious mind operate is to look at what is known as slip of the tongue. Many of us have experienced what is commonly referred to as a Freudian slip at some point of our lives. These misstatements are believed to reveal underlying unconscious thoughts or feelings. Freud believed that while the unconscious mind is largely inaccessible, the contents can sometimes bubble up unexpectedly, such as in dreams or slip of the tongue. An example of a Freudian slip is when, let's say, a man who accidentally used a former girlfriend's name when referring to a current girlfriend. While most of us might believe this to be a simple error, Freud believed that the slip of tongue showed the sudden intrusion of the unconscious mind into the conscious mind, often due to unresolved or repressed feelings. So according to Freud, thoughts and emotions outside of our awareness continue to exert an influence on our behaviors, even though we are unaware or unconscious of these underlying influences. The unconscious can include repressed feelings, hidden memories, habits, thoughts, desires, and reactions. Memories and emotions that are too painful, embarrassing, shameful, or distressing to consciously face are also stored in the enormous reservoir that makes up our unconscious mind. To identify the roots of a psychological distress, Freud employed techniques like dream analysis and free association, or the sharing of seemingly random thoughts, to bring true feelings to light. The contents of the of the conscious mind include all of the things that you are actively aware of. The closely related pre-conscious mind contains all of the things that you could potentially pull into conscious awareness. The pre-conscious also act as something of a guard controlling the information that is allowed to enter onto conscious awareness. If you are like me, have watched Ghost Fighter growing up, the conscious could be regarded to as the mundo ng mga halimaw, and the conscious is the mundo ng mga tao. And the pre-conscious serve as the barrier between these two realms, preventing super strong monsters into passing through or into entering the mundo ng mga tao. Now, the pre-conscious memories are not the same things as memories that are readily accessed, such as remembering your way home. They are unrepressed memories that we extract for a specific purpose at a specific time. Now, Sigmund Freud would have been a great Hollywood screenwriter. His story of personality is one of desire, power, control, and freedom. The plot is complex and the characters complete. Our personalities represent a drama of sort, acted out in our minds. You are the product of how competing mental forces and structures interact. Now, the ancient Greeks thought that all people were actors in the drama of the gods above. For Freud, we are simply actors of the drama in our minds. Pushed by desire, pulled by conscience, underneath the surface, our personalities represent the power struggle going on deep within us. Here's a closer look at each of these key parts of the personality, how they work individually, and how they interact with each other. The id. Now, according to Freud, the id is the source of psychic energy, making it the primary component of personality. The id is the only component of personality that is present from birth. This aspect of personality is entirely unconscious and includes instinctive and primitive behaviors. Now, the id is driven by the pleasure principle, which strives for immediate gratification of all desires, wants, and needs. If these needs are not satisfied immediately, the result is a state of anxiety or tension. For example, an increase in hunger or thirst should produce an immediate attempt to eat or drink. The id is very important early in life because it ensures that an infant's need is met. If the infant is hungry or uncomfortable, they will cry until the demands of the id are satisfied. Young infants are ruled entirely by the id. There is no reasoning with them when these needs demand satisfaction. Imagine trying to convince a baby to wait until lunchtime to eat their meal, or wait until you're finished playing Mobile Legends before you feed them. The id requires immediate satisfaction, and because the other components of personality are not yet present, the infant will cry until the needs are fulfilled. However, Immediately fulfilling these needs is not always realistic or even possible. If we were ruled entirely by the pleasure principle, we might find ourselves grabbing the things that we want out of other people's hands to satisfy our own cravings. This behavior would be both disruptive and socially unacceptable. According to Freud, the id tries to resolve the tension created by the pleasure principle through the use of primary process thinking, which involves forming a mental image of the desired object as a way of satisfying the need. Although people eventually learn to control the id, this part of personality remains the same infantile primal force throughout life. It's a development of the ego and the superego that allows people to control the id's basic instincts and act in ways that are both realistic and socially acceptable. And because of that, let's talk about the ego. Now, the ego, according to Freud, develops from the id and ensures that the impulses of the id can be expressed in a manner acceptable in the real world. The ego functions in the conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious mind. Now, the ego is the component of personality that is responsible for dealing with reality. And the ego operates based on the reality principle, which strives to satisfy the id's desire in realistic and socially appropriate manner. The reality principle weighs the cost and the benefits of an actor or of an action before deciding to act upon or abandon an impulse. In many cases, the id's impulses can be satisfied through a process of delayed gratification. The ego will eventually allow the behavior, but only in the appropriate time and place. Freud compared the id to a horse and the ego to the horse's rider. The horse provides the power and motion, while the rider provides direction and guidance. Without its rider, the horse may simply wander wherever it wishes and do whatever it pleases. The rider gives the horse direction and the command to get it to go where the rider wants to go. The ego also discharges tension created by unmet impulses through secondary process thinking, in which the ego tries to find an object in the real world that matches the mental images created by the id's primary principle. Imagine that you are stuck in a long meeting at work. You find yourself growing increasingly hungry as the meeting drags on. While the id might compel you to jump up from your seat and rush to the break room for a snack, the ego guides you to sit quietly and wait for the meeting to end. Instead of acting upon the primal urge of the id, you spend the rest of the meeting imagining yourself eating a cheeseburger. Once the meeting is finally over, you can seek out the object you were imagining or craving for and satisfy the demands of the id in a realistic and appropriate manner. The last component of personality to develop is the superego. Now, according to Freud, the superego begins to emerge at around 5 years old. The superego holds the internalized moral standards and ideals that we acquire from our parents and society, which is our sense of right and wrong. The superego provides guidelines for making judgments. And the superego has two parts. The conscience includes information about things that are viewed as bad by parents and society. These behaviors are often forbidden and lead to bad consequences, like punishments or feelings of guilt and remorse. The ego ideal is the second component, which includes the rules and standards for behaviors that the ego aspires to. The superego tries to perfect and civilize our behavior. It works to suppress all unacceptable urges of the id and struggles to make the ego act upon realistic standards rather than upon realistic principles. The superego is present in the conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious too. Now, when talking about the id, ego, and superego, it's important to remember that these are not separate entities with clearly defined boundaries. These aspects are dynamic and are always interacting to influence an individual's overall personality and behavior. Each of these character has its own idea of what the outcome of the story should be. Their struggle are fueled by powerful motives, and each one is out for itself. With many competing forces, it's easy to see how conflict may arise between the id, ego, and the superego. Freud used the term ego strength to refer to the ego's ability to function despite these dueling forces. A person who has good ego strength can efficiently manage these pressures, while a person with too much or too little ego strength can be unyielding or disruptive. According to Freud, the key to a healthy personality is a balance between the id, the ego, and the superego. Um, if the ego is able to adequately moderate between the demands of reality, the id, and the superego, a healthy and well-adjusted personality emerges. Freud believed that an imbalance between these elements would lead to a maladaptive personality. For example, an individual with an overly dominant id might become impulsive, uncontrollable, or even criminal. Such an individual acts upon their most basic urges with no concern for whether their behavior is appropriate, acceptable, or even legal. On the other hand, an overly dominant superego might lead to a personality that is extremely moralistic and judgmental. A person ruled by superego might not be able to accept anything or anyone that they perceive to be bad or immoral. So, the common misconception or the common portrayal of the id as evil and the superego as good is actually a misconception because both id and superego play their part in making sure that the human being survives and is surviving morally and is surviving within the constraints of society. So the levels of mental life and provinces of the mind refers to the structure or composition of personality. But personality also do something. Thus, Freud postulates a dynamic or motivational principle to explain the driving forces behind people's actions. To Freud, people are motivated to seek pleasure and to reduce tension and anxiety. This motivation is derived from physical and psychical energies that spring from their basic drives. Freud used the German word tribe to refer to a drive or a stimulus within the person. Freud's official translators rendered this term as instinct, but more accurately, the word should be drive or impulse. Drives operate as a constant motivational force. As an internal stimulus, drives differ from external stimuli in that they cannot be avoided through flight. According to Freud, the various drives can all be grouped under two major headings: sex or eros and aggression, distraction or thanatos. These drives originated in the id, but they come under the control of the ego. Each drive has its own form of psychic energy. Freud used the word libido for the sex drive, but energy from the aggressive drive remains nameless. Every basic drive is characterized by an impetus, a source, an aim, an object. The drive's impetus is the amount of force it exerts. Its source is the region of the body in a state of excitation or even tension. its aim is to seek pleasure by removing the excitation or reducing the tension, and its object is the person or thing that serves as the means through which the aim is satisfied. So let's look at drives and anxieties. Now, as mentioned earlier, drives uh, are segregated into two things. You have sex and aggression. So sex. Now, the aim of the sexual drive is pleasure. But this pleasure is not limited to genital satisfaction. Freud believed that the entire body is invested with libido. Besides the genital, the mouth, the anus are especially capable of producing sexual pleasure and are called erogenous zones. The ultimate aim of the sexual drive, which is the reduction of sexual tension, cannot be changed, but the path by which the aim is reached can be varied. It can take either an active or a passive form, or it can be temporary or permanently inhibited. Because the path is flexible and because sexual pleasures stem from organs other than the genitals, much behavior originally motivated by eros is difficult to recognize as sexual behavior. For Freud, however, all pleasurable activities is traceable to the sexual drive. The flexibility of sexual object or person can bring about a further disguise of eros. The erotic object can easily be transformed or displaced. Libido can be withdrawn from one person and placed into a state of free-floating tension. Or it can be reinvested in another person, including the self. For example, an infant prematurely forced to give up the nipple as a sexual object may substitute the thumb as an object of oral pleasure. Sex can take many forms, including narcissism, love, sadism, and even masochism. Now, the latter two also possess generous components of the aggressive drives, which we will be talking about later. Now, infants are primarily self-centered for Freud, with their libido invested almost exclusively on their own egos. This condition, which is universal, is known as primary narcissism. As the ego develops, children usually give up much of their primary narcissism and develop a greater interest in other people. In Freud's language, narcissistic libido is then transformed into object libido. During puberty, however, adolescents often redirect their libido back to the ego and become preoccupied with their personal appearance and other self-interests. This pronounced secondary narcissism is not universal, but a moderate degree of self-love is common to nearly everyone according to Freud. A second manifestation of eros is love, which develops when people invest their libido on an object or person other than themselves. Children's first sexual interest is the person who cares for them. Yep, this is according to Freud. Generally, their mother. During infancy, children of either sex experience sexual love for the mother. Overt sexual love for members of one's family, however, ordinarily is repressed, which brings a second type of love into existence. Freud called this second kind of love aim inhibited because the original aim of reducing sexual tension is inhibited or repressed. The kind of love people feel for their sibling or parents is generally aim inhibited. Obviously, love and narcissism are closely interrelated. Narcissism for Freud involves love of the self, whereas love is often accompanied by narcissistic tendencies, as when people love someone who serves as an ideal or model of what they would like to be. Or when someone loves another person whom he thinks can boost further his ego. Two other drives that are also intertwined are Sayidism and Masochism. Sadism is the need for sexual pleasure by inflicting pain or humiliating one on another person. Carried to one extreme, it's considered a sexual perversion. But in moderation, sadism is a common need and exists to some extent in all sexual relationships, according to Freud. It is perverted when the sexual aim of erotic pleasure becomes secondary to the destructive aim. Masochism, like sadism, is a common need, but it becomes perversion when eros becomes subservient to the destructive drive. Masochism or masochistic experience pleasure from suffering, pain, and humiliation inflicted either by themselves or by other people. Because masochists can provide self-inflicted pain, they do not depend on another person for the satisfaction of masochistic needs. In contrast, sadists must seek and find another person on whom to inflict pain and humiliation. In this respect, they are more dependent than masochists on other people. So you also have aggression. Partially as a result of his unhappy experiences during World War I and partially as a consequence of the death of his beloved daughter Sophie, Freud wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle, a book that elevated aggression to the level of the sexual drive. As he did with many of his other concepts, Freud set forth his ideas tentatively and with some caution. With time, however, aggression, like several other tentatively proposed concepts, became dogma. The aim of the destructive drive, according to Freud, is to return the organism to an inorganic state. Because the ultimate inorganic condition is death, the final aim of the aggressive drive is self-destruction. As with the sexual drive, aggression is flexible and can take a number of forms such as teasing, gossip, sarcasm, humiliation, humor, and the enjoyment of other people's suffering. The aggressive tendency is present in everyone and is the explanation for wars, atrocities, and even religious persecution. The aggressive drive also explains the need for the barriers that people have erected to check aggression. For example, commandments such as love thy neighbor as thyself are necessary because, according to Freud, it inhibits the strong, though usually unconscious drive to inflict injury on others. These precepts are actually reaction formations, which we will be talking about later on. They involve the repression of strong hostile impulse and the overt and obvious expressions of the opposite tendencies. Throughout our lifetime, life and death impulses constantly struggle against one another for ascendancy. But at the same time, both must bow to the reality principle, which represents the claims of the outer world. These demands of the real world prevents a direct, covert, and unopposed fulfillment of either sex or aggression. They frequently create anxiety, which relegates many sexual and aggressive desires to the realms of the unconscious. Lastly, we have anxiety. Sex and aggression share the center of Freudian dynamic theory with the concept of anxiety. In defining anxiety, Freud emphasized that it is a felt, affective, unpleasant state accompanied by a physical sensation that warns a person against impending danger. The unpleasantness is often vague and hard to pinpoint, but the anxiety itself is always felt. Only the ego can produce or feel anxiety, but the id, superego, and external world creates or each are involved in one of three kinds of anxiety. You have neurotic, moral, and realistic types of anxiety. The ego dependence on the id results in neurotic anxiety. Its dependence on the superego produces moral anxiety, and its dependence on the outer world lead to realistic anxiety. Neurotic anxiety is defined as the apprehension about an unknown danger. The feelings itself exist in the ego, but it originates from impulse from the id. People may experience neurotic anxiety in the presence of a teacher, employer, or some other authority figure because they previously experienced unconscious feelings of destruction against one or both parents. During childhood, these feelings of hostility are often accompanied by fear of judgment or of punishment. And this fear becomes generalized into unconscious neurotic anxiety. A second type of anxiety, moral anxiety, stems from the conflict between the ego and the superego. After children establish a superego, usually by the age of 5 or 6, they may experience anxiety as an outgrowth of the conflict between realistic needs and the dictates of their superego. Moral anxiety, for example, would result from sexual temptations if a child believes that yielding to the temptation would be morally wrong. It may also result from the failure to behave consistently with what they regard as morally right. For example, failing to care for aging parents. And a third category of anxiety is realistic anxiety. It's closely related to fear. It is defined as an unpleasant, non-specific feeling involving a possible danger. For example, we may experience realistic anxiety while driving in heavy, fast-moving traffic in an unfamiliar city, a situation fraught with real, objective danger. However, realistic anxiety is different from fear in that it does not involve a specific fearful object. We would experience fear, for example, if our motor vehicle suddenly began sliding out of control. Let's say on a slippery highway because of the rain. These three types of anxieties are seldom clear-cut or easily separated. They often exist in combination, as when fear of water, a real danger, becomes disproportionate to the situation and hence precipitate neurotic anxiety as well as realistic anxiety. This situation indicates that an unknown danger is connected with an external one. Anxiety serves as an ego-preserving mechanism because it signals us that some danger is at hand. For example, an anxiety dream signals our sensor of our impending danger, which allows us to better disguise the dream images. Anxiety allows the constantly vigilant ego to be alert for signs of threat and danger. The signals of impending danger stimulates us to mobilize for either flight or defense. Anxiety is also self-regulating because it precipitates repression, which in turn reduces the pain of anxiety. If the ego had no recourse to defensive behaviors, the anxiety would become intolerable. Defensive behaviors, therefore, serve as a useful function by protecting the ego against the pain of anxiety. Now, conflict arises from within our mind, while anxiety from realistic sources in the outside world. Conflict happens when the id has some desires which ego and superego do not agree with. The ego established defense mechanism to avoid dealing directly with sexual and aggressive implosives and to defend itself against the anxiety that accompanies them. Freud proposed several important defense mechanisms. Keep in mind, however, that defense mechanisms are not used consciously. A person does not decide to engage in one, rather these happens on an unconscious level. Although defense mechanisms are normal and universally used, When carried out to an extent or to an extreme, they lead to compulsive, repetitive, and neurotic behavior. Number one is repression, or keeping a thought, feeling, or memory of an experience out of consciousness. It's the forget about it approach. Many things may be the object of repression, including forbidden desires or a painful, emotionally difficult situation. The second is sublimation. It means changing impulses into some constructive activities. For example, if a person is angry, he goes out and paints. Or when he's nervous, he would go out and take a hike or jog for a while. According to Freud, this is the most adaptive defense mechanism. Freud stated that the effective sublimation of sexual urges and aggressiveness lead to greatest achievements. Number three is projection, or attributing a threatening urge, impulse, or aspect of oneself to someone else. If you think that the best offense is a good defense, you may use projection a lot. Instead of acknowledging that you are mad at someone, you may accuse him or her of being mad at you. Number four is interjection. Whereas projection involves placing an unwanted impulse onto an external object, interjection is a defense mechanism whereby people incorporate positive trait or positive qualities of another person into their own egos. For example, an adolescent may introject or adopt the mannerisms, values, or lifestyle of a movie star or a TikTok influencer. Such an interjection gives the adolescent an inflated sense of self-worth and keeps feelings of inferiority to a minimum. People interject characteristics that they see as valuable and that will permit them to feel better about themselves. Number five is displacement. Now, displacement refers to moving an impulse from one target object to another. For example, you are angry at your teacher, and instead of shouting at your teacher, you may then shout at your cat or dog, or you may even play violent video games. Now, number six is reaction formation. So, reaction formation is doing the opposite of what you would really like to do. For example, a person who is angry at his teacher or boss goes out of his way and becomes kind and courteous. Excessive behavior is actually one of the hallmark of reaction formation. Have you ever gone out of your way to be nice to someone you really dislike? That's actually an example of reaction formation. Number seven is regression. Or returning to an earlier or more childlike form of defense. Physical and psychological stress may sometimes lead people to abandon their more mature defense mechanisms. If you've resorted to whining when asking your teacher for an extension of a deadline, consider it a display of regression. Lastly, you have fixation. And it is the permanent attachment of the libido or the permanent attachment onto an early age, earlier, more primitive stage of development. Like other defense mechanisms, fixations are universal. People who continually derive pleasure from eating, smoking, or talking may have been fixated orally. Whereas those who are obsessed with neatness and orderliness may possess an anal fixation. Now, in summary, all defense mechanisms protect the ego against anxiety. They are universal in that everyone engages in defensive behavior to some degree. Each defense mechanism combines with repression and can each be carried out to the point of psychopathology. Normally, however, defense mechanisms are beneficial to the individual and harmless to society. In addition, one defense mechanism, sublimation, usually benefits both the individual and the society. Now, Freud believed that personality developed through a series of childhood stages in which the pleasure-seeking energies of the id become focused on certain erogenous areas. An erogenous zone is characterized as an area of the body that is particularly sensitive to stimulation. During the five psychosexual stages, which are the oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital stages, the erogenous zones associated with each stage serve as a source of pleasure. The psychosexual energy or libido was described earlier as the driving force behind behaviors. Psychoanalytic theory suggests that personality is mostly established by the age of 5. Early experiences play a large role in personality development and continue to influence behavior later in life. Each stage of development is marked by conflicts that can help build growth or stifle development. Depending upon how they are resolved, they can either help you with your development or provide a blockage to your development. If these psychosexual stages are completed successfully, a healthy personality is the result. If certain issues are not resolved at the appropriate stage, fixation can happen. A fixation, as mentioned earlier, is a persistent focus on an earlier psychosexual stage. Until this conflict is resolved, the individual remains stuck in this stage. A person who is fixated at oral stage, for example, may be overly dependent on others and may seek oral stimulation through smoking, drinking, or eating. So, the first of the psychosexual stages of development is the oral stage, which ranges between birth to 1 year. And the erogenous zone that is concerned here is the mouth. Now, during the oral stage, the infant's primary source of interaction occurs through the mouth. So the rooting and sucking reflex is especially important. The mouth is vital for eating, and the infant derives pleasure from oral stimulation through gratifying activities such as tasting and sucking. Because the infant is entirely dependent upon caretakers who are responsible for feeding the child also develops a sense of trust and comfort through this oral stimulation. The primary conflict at this stage is the weaning process. The child must become less dependent upon caretakers. If fixation occurs at this stage, Freud believes the individual would have issues with dependency or aggression. Oral fixation can result in problems with drinking, eating, smoking, or even nail biting. Now, the second stage is the anal stage, which ranges from 1 to 3 years. And the erogenous zones here is bowel and bladder control. During the anal stage, Freud believed that the bladder and bowel, that the primary focus of the libido was on controlling bladder and bowel movements. The major conflicts at this stage is toilet training. The child has to learn to control their bodily needs. Developing this control leads to a sense of accomplishment and independence. According to Freud, success at this stage is dependent upon the way in which parents approach toilet training. Parents who utilize praise and rewards for using the toilet at an appropriate time encourages positive outcomes and help children feel capable and productive. Freud believed that positive experiences during toilet training, during the stage of toilet training, serve as the basis for people to become competent, productive, and creative adults. However, not all parents provide the support and encouragement that children need during this stage. Some parents punish, ridicule, or shame a child for accidents. According to Freud, inappropriate parental response can result in negative outcomes. If parents take an approach that is too lenient, Freud suggests that an anal expulsive personality could develop in which the individual has a messy, wasteful, or destructive personality. If parents are too strict or begin toilet training too early, Freud believes that an anal retentive personality develops in which the individual is stringent, orderly, rigid, and obsessive. The third stage is called the phallic stage, which ranges from 3 to 6 years, and the erogenous is the genitals. Now, Freud suggests that during the phallic stage, the primary focus of the libido is on the genitals. At this stage, children also begin to discover the difference between males and females. Freud also believed that boys begin to view their fathers as a rival for their mother's affection. The Oedipus complex describes these feelings of wanting to possess the mother and the desire to replace the father. However, the child also fears that he will be punished by the father for these feelings, a fear Freud termed as castration anxiety. Now, the term Electra complex has been used to describe a similar set of feelings experienced by young girls. Freud, however, believed that girls instead experience penis envy and not the Electra complex. Eventually, the child begins to identify with the same-sex parent as a means of vicariously possessing the other parent. For girls, however, Freud believed that penis envy was never fully resolved and that all women remain somewhat fixated on this stage. Now, the next stage is the latent period. And this ranges from sex to puberty. And the erogenous zones are actually none because sexual feelings are inactive during this stage. The superego continues to develop while the id's energies are suppressed and this leads to the latent period. Now, children develop social skills, values, and relationships with peers and adults outside their family. The development of the ego and the superego contribute to the period of calm. The stage begins around the time that the children enter into school and become more concerned with peer relationships, hobbies, and other interests. The latent period is a time of exploration in which the sexual energy repressed or dormant. This energy is still present but is sublimated into other areas such as intellectual pursuits and social interactions. This stage is important in the development of social and communication skills and self-confidence. As with the other psychosexual stages, Freud believed that it was possible for children to become fixated or stuck in this phase. Fixation at this stage can result in immaturity and an inability to form fulfilling relationships. Lastly, you have the genital stage, which ranges from puberty to death, and the erogenous zones are the maturing sexual interest. Now, the onset of puberty causes the libido to become active once again. During the final stage of psychosexual development, the individual develops a strong sexual interest in the opposite sex. This stage begins during puberty but lasts throughout the rest of a person's life. Where in early stages, the focus was solely on individual needs, interest in the welfare of others grows during this stage. The goal of this stage is to establish a balance between the various life areas. If the other stages have been completed successfully, the individual should now be well-balanced, warm, and caring. Unlike the many of the early stages of development, Freud believed that the ego and the superego were fully formed and functioning at this point. Young children are ruled by the id, which demands immediate satisfaction of the most basic needs and wants. teens in the genital stage of development are able to balance their most basic urges against the need to conform to the demands of reality and social norms. Lastly, let us look at Freud's concept of humanity. Now, in the previous video, we outlined several dimensions of our concept of humanity. The question is, where does Freud's theory fall on these various dimensions? The first of these is determinism versus free choice. On this dimension, Freud's video on the nature of human nature would easily fall toward determinism. Freud believed that most of our behaviors is determined by past events rather than molded by present goals. Humans have little control over their present actions because many of their behaviors are rooted in unconscious strivings that lie beyond present awareness. Although people usually believe that they are in control of their own lives, Freud insisted that such beliefs are illusions. Now, a second and related issue is pessimism versus optimism. According to Freud, we come in this world in a basic state of conflict, with life and death force operating on us from opposing sides. The innate death wish drives us incessantly towards self-destruction or aggression, while the sexual drive causes us to seek blindly after pleasure. The ego experiences a more or less permanent state of conflict, attempting to balance the contradictory demands of the id and superego, while at the same time making concessions to the external world. Underneath a thin veneer of civilization, we are savage beasts with a natural tendency to exploit others for sexual and destructive satisfaction. Antisocial behaviors lies just underneath the surface of even the most peaceful person. Freud believed that worse yet, we are not ordinarily aware of the reasons for our behaviors, nor are we conscious of the hatred we feel for our friends, families, and lovers. For these reasons, psychoanalytic theory is essentially pessimistic. Now, a third approach for viewing humanity is the dimension of causality versus teleology. Freud believed that present behavior is mostly shaped by past causes rather than by people's goals for the future. People do not move towards a self-determined goal. Instead, they are helplessly caught in the struggle between Eros and Thanatos. These two powerful drives force people to compulsively repeat primitive patterns of behaviors. As adults, their behaviors is one long series of reactions. People constantly attempt to reduce tension, to relieve anxieties, to repress unpleasant experiences, to regress to earlier, more secure stages of development, and to compulsively repeat behaviors that are familiar and safe. Therefore, we rate Freud's theory very high on causality. Now, on the dimension of consciousness, conscious versus unconscious, versus unconscious, psychoanalytic theory obviously leans heavily in the direction of unconscious motivation. Freud believed that everything from slip of the tongue to religious experiences is the result of a deep-rooted desire to satisfy sexual or aggressive drives. These motives make us a slave to our unconscious, although we are aware of our actions. Freud believed that the motivations underlying those those actions are deeply embedded in our unconscious and are frequently quite different from what we believe them to be. Now, a fifth dimension is social versus biological influences. As a physician, Freud's medical training disposed him to see human personality from a biological viewpoint. Yet Freud frequently speculated about the consequences of prehistoric social units And about the consequences of the individual's early social experiences. Because Freud believed that many infantile fantasies and anxieties are rooted in biology, we rate him low in social influence. Now, the sixth is the issue of uniqueness versus similarities. On this dimension, psychoanalytic theory takes a middle position. Humanity's evolutionary past gives rise to a great many similarities among people. Nevertheless, individual experiences, especially those of early childhood, shape people into somewhat unique manner and account for many of the differences among personalities. Now, that ends our lesson on Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory. My name is Dex Kamitan, and thank you for watching.